So most industrialized countries with a high standard of living are democracies. And there's no one single definition of democracy. The way the book describes and defines democracy is with three specific political institutions. So one is the rule of law, in which all individuals are treated the same. So whether the person is, an unemployed worker or the president or the CEO of a big company, all people have to follow the rule of law. The second is civil liberties, so the rights of free speech, assembly, and the press. You could add other civil liberties like freedom of religion. And then finally, inclusive, fair, and decisive elections. So the idea is that everybody has the right to vote, everybody gets the chance to vote, and the losing party accepts defeat and leaves office. And so there's really no government that perfectly satisfies these three criteria. We can think of examples, even in the United States, where the rule of law doesn't always feel to be applied equally, where some civil liberties are denied, and where we don't always have inclusive, fair, and decisive elections. But most countries that we think of, as democracies come close to all three of these, including the United States. So one way that we can model democracy is with the median voter model. And the idea is to use a model that was developed by an economist named Hotelling, where he first thought of it as two vendors on either side of a beach, say. And if they can choose where they want to be, if people are evenly distributed along the beach and they can choose where they want to be, then they want to be as close to each other as possible and right in the middle. And the reason for that is that in this case, so if we look right here, for candidate A or store A, they'll get all of the people to the left, and candidate B will get all of the people to the right. Now, the median voter model says that candidates end up being the same, and we do see some similarities between candidates, although we also see some differences as well. And so some of those differences, might be interesting, but we end up often with a swing voter, and so that swing voter could be in the middle, but there could be things that move the candidates one direction or the other. For example, if people don't vote, if they don't vote, particularly on one side or the other, then candidates will move away from the people who don't vote. It could be that money becomes very important, and if there's money on either side of the political spectrum, then candidates might move in that direction. And that could be why, there could be a left-leaning candidate that gets money from left-leaning people and a right-leaning candidate that gets money from right-leaning people and organizations. Uh, and of course, political parties might care about things other than getting elected, right? It could be that people get involved in politics because they feel very strongly about their values and what they want to accomplish. Um, and it could be that voters are not exactly evenly distributed along a political spectrum, and that a one-dimensional political spectrum doesn't really make sense, right? It could be that people have political views that are along lots of different spectrums, right? You could be pro-gun rights and pro-choice and pro, uh, you know, small government, and pro equal opportunity, right? So there could be lots of different things that voters care about, and it might not just go along one even spectrum. So when we think about accountability, the idea is that democracy hopefully is more accountable, and we can think about accountability in two ways. One is that we can think about it in terms of exit. So if you don't like what the government's doing, you vote them out, they get kicked out. The other is voice, and the idea about voice is that, hey, even if you don't get to kick somebody out, you get to express your opinion. And so voice can be important not only in government, but also in business, right? You can say to a company that you're a customer of, hey, I don't like it when you do that. Don't do that anymore, please. And they'll have an economic incentive to listen to you because you have the potential to exit. Democracy has the most possibility for voice and exit, right? If we have a dictatorship, the only exit is a revolution, and so there's also often very little voice. If we have sort of limited competition, maybe democratic elites, then there might be limited exit, especially if there's one political party, and they might not allow much voice in terms of freedom of the press and things like that. So uh, countries have sort of become more and more democratic over the last 150 years, say, based on those three criteria that we talked about in the beginning of this video. New Zealand was really the first one to become fully democratic. Australia was close behind, but of course it, like the United States, limited voting to the majority population and disenfranchised a minority. So it was the Aboriginal population in Australia, and it was the black population in the United States, at least until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Um, we can think of sort of two waves of this advance. One was between the end of World War One and the Russian Revolution. Um, so that's, for instance, when women got the right to vote in many countries. And then the end of World War II and decolonization is when a lot of other countries that had been under either a colony of another country or other undemocratic government adopted universal suffrage. So we can see that democratic spending priorities differ between countries that we can consider democratic. So these categories include general public services. We might expect them to be higher in democracies. Military spending could be smaller or lower. Economic affairs, public order and safety, social protection, schooling, health. And you can see, for instance, the United States spends a lot on health. It spends a fair amount on schooling, but much less on social protection, things like Social Security, unemployment benefits, than, say, Finland does. We spend more on the military than does Finland, but of course, South Korea spends a fair amount on the military as well. South Korea is really more similar to us, but spends a smaller amount on healthcare. Most industrialized countries spend a smaller amount on healthcare because they have a public health insurance program covering everybody, which we do not. So varieties of democracy can come in a number of different ways. So we can have transfers of power by elections only, also by non-electoral means, and we can have strong or weak democratic accountability. So countries like Germany, the UK, France, the US would be in this category. Singapore here, they have regular elections, but they've only had one party in charge. Um, Italy has strong democratic accountability, but has other ways of um, transferring power. And of course, Pakistan, while a democracy, has had a number of military coups and has not had strong democratic accountability. So democracy does seem to make a difference. So when people are extended the right to vote, the spending and tax priorities change. The one example that they give in the United States is that women gained the right to vote in different states at different times, and we saw that social service spending on healthcare programs, child programs increased as women got the right to vote and politicians started competing for their votes. Another example is working hours. So we have years of democracy on the horizontal axis here and the average annual hours worked on the vertical axis here. And you can see there's a clear downward correlation. So countries like Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Finland that have had democracies around longer tend to work fewer hours per year. Countries like Mexico, South Africa, South Korea that have had a democracy around for fewer years tend to work more hours per year. And the U.S., if you only count it as a full democracy since the passage of the Civil Rights Act, fits somewhere right in the middle there. Another example is inequality. So inequality has been reduced more in countries that have had democracy longer, and it's been reduced less in countries that have had democracy for a shorter time. So if we look at South Africa, for example, even though it's been a democracy for about 20 years and Black South Africans have had the right to vote since then and have been the group in political power, the income inequality, even in just disposable income, not just market income, has not really fallen, and it's still one of the highest in the world.